Stream of the ACT Chess Association online events. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, and I'm covering a game that was played last night in the ACT online standard event. This event is run with a time limit of 40 minutes plus 15 seconds increment, and was played between, actually, not two of the leading players, but towards the end of the tournament. But I thought I'd pick on this game because it's got some interesting features in it. In the actual tournament itself, a couple of our junior players, Larry Cheng and Minchin Yang, lead the field on 3.5 out of 4, ahead of 3 players on 3 points. Yang, Minchin and Larry have played each other already, and with 2 rounds to go, it just means the results of their games against other players will decide this tournament. But the game I'm looking at are between one of our youngest competitors in the tournament, who's a very young junior. I think he's about 7 years old, and one of our new players who is playing online chess. So let me just get to the game and we can start having a look here. So this game contains a lot of up and downs where white was winning for quite a while, but black just found a nice sort of counter attack at the end to win. And white played bishop c4. If you see bishop c4 against the Sicilian, it means a couple of things. One, they're trying to get into a sort of Sozin type Fischer defense through a transposition, or 2, they don't quite understand the difference between how you play Sicilians and how you play e4, e5 games. d4 is normal here, and the darks where bishop for white can go to g5, while the bishop can go to c4 in some lines. As it turns out later in this game, funnily enough, they do end up in a normal position. But bishop c4 itself normally runs into a move like e6. And instead of the bishop attacking f7, it's now biting granite on e6. So a few more moves, knight c3, knight to c6, and pawn exclamation mark on the grounds that you just need to play this move. Because in e4 openings, one of your goals is generally to try and play d4. And in d4 openings, one of your goals is, funnily enough, to play e4. So after we take and we take, white's developed both knights, has the 2 bishops, ready to castle. Black, on the other hand, hasn't really done much in this position, but this is a typical system that gives white a lot of space in the centre while sorting their own side out, in the hope that at some point they will expand from the 3rd rank through to the 4th rank and catch white off. After bishop e7, probably here is both sides of castle. In played the unprovoked takes. A bit of a move for a couple of arguments or reasons. One, the knight from has kind of moved. Sorry, I'll just click this. We'll go to here, we'll go to here, and we'll go to here. And it's taken 3 moves to get here, while the black knight has only taken essentially 1 move to get here. So white has played 4 moves to capture something, and black has only played 1 move, plus the recapturing move. So white tends to give away a little here. The other reason why knight takes c6 unprovoked in this position is it gives the rook on a1 something to do now. It can go to b1 and attack along the b file all the way down to b7. In one of the early human computer matches, David Levy was playing one of the versions of the chess engine developed at Northwestern University, and it liked to take on c6, and David Levy noticed this early in his preparation and won a few games just by using this attack down the b file. But queen to f3, castles and castles queenside. And normally castle and queenside is now a precursor to both sides attacking on their half of the board, as in black will try and attack the white king on the C, B and A files, while white will try and attack the black king down the F, G and H files. But it's black's move, and d5's a good move here. It's the right move. You fight back in the centre. Suddenly your position's starting to look a lot freer than it did before. Having said that, white can just ignore the threat to the bishop by playing rook h1, because the pawn on d5 is pinned against the queen, so we can't take the bishop without losing the queen. Instead, white played e5, which turns out to be a mistake, but neither side quite played the next part of the game properly. So here's a good point to have a look at. I'm going to move the knight. If I'm black, there's going to be some exchanges of pieces. What happens at the end of what essentially is a 4 sequence? So knight goes to d7. after we swap bishops, the point here is white still left the bishop on c4 under attack by the d-pawn, and now there's no pin, by the way. So it really doesn't mean that the bishop has to move, but at the same time, nothing is protecting the pawn on e5. So in a sense, white has just given away a pawn. So white played the bishop back to d3 because there are some tactical tricks in this position after knight takes e5. But before we play knight takes e5, one of the things that young players don't do and new players don't do, and if you want to improve at chess, you've got to learn to do, is even if take the time to look at either white might not move or do you have better move, takes e5 on its own, you queen e5, king move, and knight takes e5. And the queen is protecting the knight. And this becomes important because after knight takes e5, white missed a trick here. White could have played bishop takes h7 check, king takes, queen h5, and now the queen is attacking two pieces at once. And notice this trick doesn't work if the black queen has already moved here with check. So this is why I said look at the check, this line, because if you play this line with the queen on g5, it just loses a piece. And after king g8, we just take the knight on e5. And material is equal, except white has a lot better position here because the black pieces are still huddled in the back rank a little bit more. White has slightly more space. Pawns are equal, but at the same time, the bishop on c8 is the problem piece for the moment. The bishop may go to a6, is probably the best square for it, but I'd like to be white here. Instead, white tried the same trick, but in a different way. Queen to h5, threatening to take down on h7, and threatening to take the knight on e5. But if black had just simply spotted f5 in this position, white's just surrendered a pawn for no good reason. Because what do? You can't play g4 to try and trick black into taking because we take with the knight instead and you're just giving away material. But instead, whether black, of course, didn't look at all the moves in the position and decided that the next move was the only move that saved it, or just completely missed the threat, black played h6. Double question mark, because sure, it stops the checkmate as a piece. Okay, and queen takes. Now, normally, I wouldn't be showing this game from this point on because, well, you've just blundered a piece. But that's as may be. This game still has some interest, and this is why I'm keeping going with it. So queen to g5 check. Normally, you don't swap pieces off when you're behind in material. Happy birthday, Lee Faraci, who kind of does suggest this as a joke, of course. H takes g5, and now white is just completely winning because white has an extra piece in terms of a pawn. And normally the process now here is you swap off material, especially the big pieces, until you get to an ending where you have one extra piece and you use that extra piece to win the game. But let's see what happened instead. So h4, part of the plan. Let's offer a swap. And if black takes, then in fact that's really good for white, because after rook takes, we've now got two choices here. We've got threatening bishop h7 check, forcing the king to the h-file for a deadly discovered check, or we just bring the other rook across and then we look at trying to checkmate on h8. So black at least sensibly played g4 to block that. h5, because really white wants to open up this h-file. Pawn to a5, possibly let the bishop come out to a6, but even then. So there's a few more moves where both sides are just playing what I would call obvious moves, where white is just trying to swap a few things off, black is trying to protect some things. g3 becomes interesting later on, I'll point out, not straight away, but later on. Bishop goes back to d3 and f5. So even though white is still winning this game, and white is winning for a long time, it's kind of interesting to see that black hasn't decided to self-destruct. And in fact, white kind of has an idea if they can push as many pawns up the board, maybe there'll be some trouble for white. Rook here, and then we play e4, and white swaps pawns. Now, normally, to be honest, there are two things wrong with swapping pawns here. One is, when you're ahead material, you should swap pieces, not pawns. Because guess what? If you've just got a king and a bishop versus a king, that position is a draw. If you've got a king and a knight versus a king, that position is also a draw because you can't checkmate with just that piece. So the idea is you need to have at least one pawn on the board to win the game. And it turns out the more pawns you have on the board with the extra piece, the easier it is to win, because your extra piece is going to run around eating as many pawns as possible. And there are more pawns to eat, obviously, when there are more pawns on the board. The second problem with this move here is it opens the f file for the rook, and the rook can go happily down to f2 in some lines. So the bishop hops back here. Bishop d7 I didn't really care. I thought rook f2 straight away might have been the right move. Here, attacking the pawn on g2. Bishop d7, so the knight goes to a4. Rook a b8, knight goes to c5. And now bishop goes to c8, pawn to a4. And here, black plays another what should be a game-ending blunder, bishop to b7. Because either, again, they missed, or might have thought this was a good idea, but I'm pretty sure they just missed the knight fork here on d7. Knight d7 attacks the two pieces. Okay. And after rook b8, we just take and takes. And now white is just up a rook for a pawn. And again, this game should be over at this point. But, as I said, I wouldn't be showing you this game unless there's some interesting stuff at the end. King starts to march across. Rook f2 now gets played, and it's around here that white starts to go wrong. White kind of goes a little bit passive and misses some more aggressive moves. For example, king e3, rook takes g2, rook hg1, just takes away the g-pawn. And once the g-pawn is gone, there aren't as many tricks left in the position as there were before. Could have also tried rook pawn to c3 here just to stop the black pawns from coming up the board. Because again, rook takes g2 is generally going to be met by rook takes g1. And even if we swap, there's nothing now that can protect the pawn on g3. And we're simplifying the position in our favour a little bit. Instead, worried about losing the pawn, rook hg1. One of the things I've noticed when players are materially ahead and they don't quite know what to do, often the big mistake they make is defending the wrong material. They go, oh, I'll defend something that's quite insignificant while losing sight of the big picture. So rook hg1, suddenly pawn to d4. Oh, this is starting to look a bit worrisome now. Rook fe1, and then e3 check. And suddenly those pawns that were sitting down on shore, e5, d5 and e4, and getting in the way of the bishop, have now moved up to d4 and e3. And after king e1 and c5, guess what? The bishop that previously was terrible because it was blocked in by this pawn chain is now a lot better off because it's no longer blocked in by this pawn chain. King went to d1 because clearly at this point white had run out of things to do. Okay. And then bishop c6 was played. There is a chance, by the way, for black still to go horribly wrong in this position, including prematurely swapping. Bishop takes g2, rook takes f2, and when you capture the rook, then the bishop hangs, and you've just lost a bishop. You could play rook takes g2 again, but white would love to swap off a few pieces, because after the bishop retreats, the rook takes, and you're still a rook up, and that g-pawn's gone, and there's nothing too scary left in this position. Instead, black marked time with bishop to c6, white played b3, and then, whether by design or by accident, black realised something that was very important in this position. In fact, it's very hard for white to do things here. If we take the rook, if we swap rooks, we're going to see what happens, and it's not pleasant. But if we leave things the way they are, there's not a lot of squares for white's pieces to move to. For example, if the rook on g1 moves, bishop takes g2 is not a bad move after all. So the king moves up, and what does white do? White can move the bishop around a bit, but that doesn't help at the end of the day. Bishop d3 was probably the best move, but even king h6 here. But after king h7, white cracked, and white took on f2, and now black, surprisingly, is winning. Even though black is down a rook, the pawn on f2 is going to be the real strong pawn. Now, there were two ways of capturing in this position. One was with the g-pawn and one was with the e-pawn, and it may not make a difference, but when I was watching this game, instinctively I felt that taking here was better, and the reason why taking here was better is when you take the g-pawn, because now you can't defend it, you're going to have two passed pawns getting down the board. And the old rule of thumb is connected passed pawns on the 6th rank are worth about as much as a rook. Okay, so imagine how strong protected passed pawns with 1 on the 7th rank are going to be, they're definitely going to be worth more than the rook, as this game now showed. But after e takes f2, so we play rook takes f1, we take here, bishop to g3, the d3 check forces the king to move. And the point here is, again, white doesn't really have anything to do, because essentially what the plan is now going to be for black, take the h-pawn if you can, take the rook when you can, and sure, there's going to be bishop versus, but you can probably now swing your king up fast enough to help protect these pawns as they come down the board. You might even get your king as far as h2 before you even decide to swap the rook for the bishop. King e2, king takes h5, and even if you play something like this to try and get out of trouble by going, hey, please promote that pawn, and then after rook takes f1, bishop takes f1, king takes f1, you've actually surrendered something quite valuable, which is the pawn on f2. Instead, you just play king g4, and then the idea is to try and get the king up to h2 before you make that capture. Or essentially move the bishop out of the way and then just march your pawns down the board. Instead, g takes f2 turned out to be okay, and then black came up with a fantastic tactical trick in the c, which ends the game. Rook to h1. You could have flicked in bishop d3 check first, which would have avoided what was going to happen next, but might not have changed the outcome of the game. Again, king h6, rook h1, bishop takes g2, rook h2, bishop f3 check. King has to move away, and king g5 is still pretty black stage. But the rook went to h1, bishop went on h2 here, and I think at this point, white might have been expecting this move here. Just promote. Okay, and after takes and takes, okay, white isn't winning much as they thought they were winning. In fact, black is still in this position, but it lost a chance of making a queen. But instead, in rook h2, black found the fantastic bishop f3. And the point here now, of course, is that the bishop is pinned against the king. Okay, the king can't move to protect the bishop, and any other move by the king just loses the bishop. The rook can't go back to h1 because the bishop will simply take on h1, and because of the pin, the bishop can't capture the pawn when it moves up the board to make a queen. And in fact, white resigned in this position. But I'll just throw in the other line, of course, is if we take here, oopsie doopsie, okay, you've just been checkmated, okay, which is very embarrassing as well. And so it was no wonder black won in that position and white resigned. So that was a really up and down game, but it is typical of games played between newer players. That's why I picked it out today. I did like the finish. That's why I also featured it. But essentially what tends to happen is we get a good position, we don't know what to do with it, we don't double check our calculations, and suddenly we're losing pieces with move like h6 and what was the other example? Knight d7, so we lost a piece, then we've lost an exchange, so we're down a rook. But on the other hand, our opponent doesn't quite know what's important in the position and lets us get away with moves like this when suddenly these pawns, which weren't doing much before, have suddenly marched up the board and have flipped the game in our opponent's favour. So that was from last night's ACT Long Time Control Tournament. My name is Sean Press. I run the events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, and then finding the time, go through the games the next day and put them up here. Originally, I streamed them on Twitch, and then I copy them across to YouTube if you want to look at them, not live, but later in the day or later in the week. So, and I do these summaries normally the day after the tournament, and that was from last night. Coming up tomorrow, so I'll probably do another summary Monday, and then we have Blitz and Rapid on Monday and Tuesday nights. So until next time, thanks for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you later.